We have today a beautiful parable from our Lord about the Pharisee and the tax collector coming to the temple. To begin our reflection today, I'd like to pose a question to you. When you come to church, do you feel unworthy or worthy? In the presence of the Lord, do you feel worthy or unworthy? We'll unpack that in a little bit. That's important. We have two people coming to the temple in the gospel today. One feels very worthy and with no need of God's mercy or forgiveness. He speaks the prayer not to God but to himself. And the other one comes, kneels down, he couldn't even raise his head up, pound his chest like we do at the beginning of Mass, and says, "Have mercy on me, of God, for I'm a sinner." When we come before the presence of the one who is truth, beauty, light, holiness, himself, there should be some unworthiness on our part, because we are not all that. We want to be, we are striving for it, but the more I'm exposed to the light, the more I see my unworthiness, my sins. It's like when we drive during the summer, especially when we drive on the freeway or even on the countryside roads, and our windshield is packed with mosquitoes, smash into our windshields. If you're driving during the night, you are able to see very well as long as no cars are coming the opposite direction. And, they kind of shine their light to you. Once a car comes the other way, you see how many mosquitoes are there, and it's very difficult to see. When St. Peter encounters Jesus in the boat after the miraculous catch of fish, he says to him, "Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinner." Before the light, we see our truth, who we are. And not in a way to be discouraged, but in a way to be led more deeply into communion with Him, who offers us His love, His forgiveness, His peace, His redemption. The two parables in chapter 18 of Luke's Gospel, which is the Gospel we read today, the first parable we heard was last weekend. It taught us about the need to pray continually, to pray with persistence. Today's parable or story teaches us to pray with humility, asking God for mercy. And this is how the gospel begins. Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despise everyone else. So he's addressing this to people that think they have no need of God's mercy. And then he goes on to explain the next two characters that appear in the gospel. So the first one is the Pharisee. The Pharisee gets in there, took up his position in church, in the temple, and spoke this prayer to himself. "Oh God, I thank you that I'm not like the rest of humanity." Like it's you, right? I'm not greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector behind me. I give my weekly collection to the church. I help the poor. I pray my rosary. I go to church. I make the sign of the cross when I get up. We can go on and on. And then behind him is the tax collector that says, "Have mercy on me, God, a sinner." The Pharisee is proud. He will be humiliated for presuming that adherence to traditional forms of piety is an automatic guarantee of divine blessings. Sadly, the Pharisee overlooked his need for God's mercy. Now, remember in the Bible, the Pharisees are actually exemplary in the life of Jewish piety. They were not bad people. So that's not the point here. They were actually the ones who were trying to live to the best they could the call to holiness that God required of the people of Israel. But he became proud in doing that. And that can be a trap for us as well, trying to live our good Christian life, our Catholic life. And we can think we have it all figured out to the point where we actually don't need even God anymore. Because I have everything in order. The tax collectors, on the other hand, were considered second-class citizens, sinners. They were the bad people. A prayer of humility is brought about by the tax collector. He showed his dependence on God. Unlike the Pharisee, he does not parade any of his credentials before God and only implores forgiveness. So we have two very important themes on our Christian life here: pride and humility. We don't want to be prideful. We want to be humble. What is pride? Pride is considered the original and most serious of the 7 deadly sins and the source of the others. Pride means turning yourself into God. That's the theological meaning of it. Lucifer, Satan, is the prime example of prideful attitude. I will not serve, according to the meditation of the church and tradition. That's what Satan said when God gave the angels the choice to choose him or not. In case you didn't know this, the angels had, like we do, we can mess up, but we can come to confession. God gives us more than one chance. The angels, because of their nature, only have one. And so either they choose to serve God or not. And Satan, Lucifer, chose not to serve him and went on rebellion and disobedience of God. And he wants to lead us all to that same position where he is at. So who opposed Satan in heaven? St. Michael. Don't we pray that prayer of St. Michael? When we start doing that later, maybe in Advent, after Mass, begin to pray the prayer of St. Michael, to pray for God's protection for us. But St. Michael says, who you think you are? No one is like God. That's what his name means. No one is like God. Pride is identified as believing that one is essentially better than others, failing to acknowledge the accomplishments of others, and excessive admiration of the personal self, especially holding self out of proper position toward God. Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy, and among this work, it is called the Inferno, Hell. So in his literature, he describes what kind of punishments are given to the different sins we can commit here on earth in hell. So this is what he says. He defines pride as love of self perverted to hatred and contempt for one's neighbor. The penitents are burdened in hell with stone slabs on their necks, which force them to keep their heads bowed. So those who were prideful, like, their chest out and showing themselves up, in hell they are forced to walk like with the stones on their necks and down. That's Dante Alighieri, because that's literature, that's an image he portrays. But it indeed tells us that the prideful, God says, will be humbled by him, and the humble will be exalted. We want to be exalted by God, to be brought close to him. What is the antidote? What opposes pride? Humility. And what is humility? Basically, the word comes from humus, meaning earth, the reality. Basically, is saying, keep your feet on the ground. Don't elevate yourself to a position that is not yours. St. Thomas Aquinas said that humility is truth. The truth about who you are in relationship to God and in relationship to others. You are not more or less than what you are for God and to God. The humble stands in an attitude of I will serve. Now, in brief, the antidote to pride then is total abandonment to the mercy of God and complete trust in His grace that empowers us to abandon sin and to live in charity. The spiritual life begins with the acknowledgement of our sinfulness and our need for God's mercy and forgiveness. Sin is a grave infraction of the law of God. Sin destroys divine life in the soul of the sinner. So when we go to confession, we are asked to confess the mortal sins we have committed. What is a mortal sin? A grave infraction of the law of God that destroys the divine life in the soul of the sinner. That divine life the church calls sanctifying grace, the grace that keeps us in holiness. This mortal sin constitutes a turn away from God. For a sin to be mortal, 3 conditions must be present: grave matter, full knowledge of the evil of the act, and full consent of the will. So I know it's something very bad. I have acknowledged that. I know how evil it is, and I still do it. That constitutes a mortal sin. Venial sin is a sin that wounds our relationship with God but allows God's life to remain in the soul. A venial sin will be getting angry with your spouse on the way to church because they were not ready to come on time, or with your children, you had to get them up and you shouted more than you needed to. Okay, so all those things, we offer to God all that when we arrive. But if we become extremely angry and actually hit someone out of that anger, that can be a mortal sin. The repetition of sins, even venial ones, engenders vices, among which are the capital sins. Capital sins are negative attitudes, distortions of the spirit that keep us from being alive. So there are 7, and to close the homily, I'll just mention them, and they're opposing virtue. The virtue that helps us to overcome them. So pride. What opposes pride? Humility. Envy. What opposes envy? Kindness. Wrath. What opposes wrath? Patience. Sloth. What opposes sloth in our life? Being lazy? Diligence. Avarice is the next one. What opposes the sin of avarice? Generosity. Gluttony. What opposes gluttony? Temperance. Lust. What opposes lust? Chastity. Let's ask for the grace to be humble before the Lord and to be brought into the eternal dwellings of heaven one day.